This is a series I've had my eye on for a while. After many years of development, it finally dropped last week. Streaming on Amazon so that it can't be with all the other DC stuff at Max. Thanks! Batman Caped Crusader is a in-spirit noir series that takes the Batman mythos and brings it to the 1940s. That alone should be interesting enough. Batman originally came out in the late 1930s, through the Detective Comics until it finally got its own book line. Here, the Caped Crusader was a lot more gruff and unpolished than the traditional image we have today. I personally read through these comics before, only once before, many years ago, so my memory isn't super fresh on them. But don't worry, because this series is not meant to adapt those, but to reinvent our modern image of Batman backwards to his glorious days, like the old racist serials.
Land transplanted bodily to America and known as Little Tokyo. Since a wise government rounded up the shifty-eyed Japs, it has become virtually a ghost street.
One of the major reasons that people are excited for this series is because of Bruce Timm, one of the major creative forces, one of, the 90s animated series, which for many people is the definitive Batman, myself included. Although I should mention that Timm wasn't the only creative force behind that series. His style, however, is the definitive image of these characters for many of us. The animated series excelled at both modernizing and bringing attention to these classic stories from Batman comics for larger audiences. There's little more praise I can offer this series other than just prattling on about its perfection. I'm mainly discussing this to bring up why so many people were excited for this new series. It was originally pitched to be a continuation of the animated series, but Timm wasn't very interested in that, but rather wanted to make a new series while incorporating ideas that he couldn't implement from the original due to censorship or concerns for younger audiences. The series has some big names also attached to it, such as J.J. Abrams, which is random, and Matt Reeves, who was behind the Batman film with Robert Pattinson, which could be a good thing or a bad thing depending how you felt about that movie. Timm had always had inspirations tied to the classic style of Batman, as well as just this 1930s, 1940s look, which worked so good in the animated series, although its time period was never a direct plot point. Here, the new series, it's evidently 1940s from style to technology, which does make it stand out greatly over the animated series. The major appeal in Batman in this setting is seeing how he can do all of his Batman things, all of his detective work in such a limited technological period. Batman, of course, has always had technologies advanced over what the common man has, but here he is still limited. What I found impressive watching this series was how little I was actually interested in Batman. I found the side characters, the villains, and their stories to be just so much more interesting. And it was cool to see how Batman intermingled, but he really just never felt like the main focus, even when he was supposed to be. He was also kind of freaky in this one.
All of them. I'm going to make them pay. And you're going to help me.
The new voice is definitely not Conroy, but the trailers gave me the impression that he was trying to be. But he's not. Hamish Linklater is the new voice, and he does a good job as Bruce, but his Batman just lacks a certain charisma.
Someone's declared war on Thorn, but they're covering their tracks, being smart about it.
And I'm sure a lot of people will say that's the point. Sure, but there should still be a charm to it, to Batman's voice. They seem to be going for a more brooding approach. Maybe that was pushed by Matt Reeves. Even poor Alfred is treated just as the Help, who he addresses as Pennyworth in the series.
I'm not sure which is stranger. Pennyworth believing in ghosts, or that you two are so chummy?
Well, I was raised to treat the staff like people, Bruce. You might want to give it a try sometime.
It's still a young Batman, mind you, in his early days, so there's still plenty more to play around with his character as he further grows up into this role. The real star of the show ended up surprising me. I found Barbara to be the most bland at the beginning of the series, especially after doing this. At the start, she was seen as this fiery female lawyer, which would have been a bigger deal given the time period, but the show doesn't really play into that, with this naive sense of justice. Pretty stale on paper, but as the show went on, I started to see her as a far more important character, especially towards the end with her dynamic with Harvey. I think that everyone, even those who mock her naivety, really admire it, which is why even the Batman finds himself teaming up with her in the end, teaching him an important lesson as well. I was always a fan of Tim's Barbara, even though he was pushing her in weird directions at times. I was surprised how they won me over with her in this version, considering the lackluster start. I think as the show went on, it really unveiled how important of a character she actually is. Of course, there have been controversial changes made to characters in this series, which upset some comic book purists. That can't be a real term, can it? Oh no! Comic book characters got remodeled. That's absurd. That's never happened before. Oh man, gender bending a character that we've seen the same for 90 years? I can't imagine such a thing happening to a comic book character. I do find it incredibly silly to be using this against the series. Comic book characters are famous for being remodeled or changed. I find the weirdest thing about it now that the Penguin all of a sudden has a fandom. I've been a Batman fan my whole life, and I've never seen a Penguin fandom before. I really did not care that the Penguin was gender swapped. Hell, it worked pretty good for Octavius. Why not for Oswald? The difference, of course, being that Octavius is a bit more interesting of a character over the Penguin, who is Penguin. To be fair, the entire first episode wasn't super great in general, but Oswalda was fine. They did well for the narrative, even though she was basically a great value version of Mom from Futurama. It made for a good opening. We have this villain who doesn't really have powers, but is still iconic enough and has all these goofy gadgets and is threatening to open this whole turf war going on with Thorn, who's just a gangster. And it was pretty fun. The thing that did bother me though, why can she sing? I mean, come on. I'll accept all the other changes, but you want me to believe that the Penguin can sing? Yeah, right. The second episode was probably my favorite of all. If you know me well enough, I'm a huge horror fan, especially for the classics. And this whole episode was a love letter to the Universal classics. Clayface and the makeup artists were obviously Jack Pierce and Boris Karloff. Now, I'm confident they didn't get into any crazy shenanigans like this, but the spirit is definitely there. This episode focuses on the Carlo version of Clayface. There's actually a couple different ones, who in the original was an actor that went crazy when his star film was being remade. Kinda reminds me of how Adam West got really mad about the '89 movie.
For this is a little cuckoo. His coconut is strange.
He has a real Phantom of the Opera thing going on, where he kills the people who wronged him and tries to be the ultimate actor. Here he is motivated by his concerns of his appearance, being told that he's got the skill, but not the face. He took that quite personal. The episode also heavily incorporated and reinvented Montoya, who was actually created by Tim and Paul Dini in the animated series. Montoya acts like the hard-boiled detective, but she isn't because her morals aren't so gray. She's actually one of the few honest cops with an actual sense of justice. The episode plays like a mixture of a detective story with Phantom of the Opera. There's even a London After Midnight reference, which is really cool. The third episode focuses on Catwoman, played by Christina Ricci. It was cool to see the vintage Catwoman animated. Her story is a bit different. I don't really think it's that incredibly drastic of a change that will take anyone aback. It might be more unique for those who only know the modern Catwoman, but Selina's stories in the original comics were kind of weird and cluttered. I will say though, I very much enjoyed this performance, but other than that, the episode didn't do a whole lot for me. It did introduce the new Harley, who I will discuss in a bit, and it was a fun idea to have Harley Quinn try to perform therapy on Bruce Wayne, who had a really cool moment in this episode. The following episode was definitely more interesting as its focus was on the police force, and there's this overarching plot point of Flash and Bullock being dirty cops that really gets amped up here. Bullock was always a morally gray character, more on the bad side cop character. In this version, he's just a straight up asshole, and he's voiced by John DiMaggio, who I love dearly. This episode is all about the police force trying to catch Batman, because the mayor is scared for his own campaign. So we have the lawful police force being pressed to catch the unlawful Batman out of personal interest, over more so than the fact that it's the right thing to do. Gordon and Montoya have to do it because their job is on the line. And the sad thing about this episode is that the characters who end up doing the right thing in the end are the ones who get punished, and the bad guys are the ones who get rewarded. Leading into my other favorite episode of the series, which is focused on Harley Quinn. I'm not going to sugarcoat it, I'm a Harley fan, and I will say Arkham definitely played a role in that. It was Tim's Quinn that will always be my favorite. Harley is always a fun character who has crazy moral dilemmas that make her pretty damn interesting, given the right writer. This series doesn't have a Mr. J for her, so what's the approach? There are obvious changes to the character that have upset some people. One, that Harley is now Asian, and that she is romantically involved with Montoya. They must not really be Harley fans if that upsets them, but you know, I will say, unlike the Penguin, Tim did create Harley, so I have faith in his changes, and I'm glad that I did, because this might be the most interesting one since the 90s. And yes, I am a fan of the HBO series. This Harley is just the go-to therapist for everybody, but we find out that she's actually using her abilities to brainwash the patients. She has some sort of contentment with capitalism, as her victims are all these wealthy individuals who she influences to donate and get rid of all their wealth and give it to charities. It also makes her previous session with Bruce stand out more. Jamie Chung plays Harley, and her performance is really good. The more bubbly persona you might be used to, we actually see in her everyday life, whereas the villain persona, she's actually more serious and a little bit sinister.
Welcome to my inpatient facility, Mr. Collins. I call it the playpen.
She's not a flat-out evil character, and one could even say that her intentions are kind of noble, but at the same time, brainwashing people is not okay. And it also brings in these moral dilemmas for Barbara, who has this suspicion that Harley is doing something bad, but that's also her friend, making for good character development. I think out of all of the character changes, Harley was the most exciting for me. And to a lesser extent, I also enjoyed the Gentleman Ghost, although his design was alright. This episode gave us a good amount of Batman actually doing some detective work, which was nice, and it had this really sweet moment with Alfred that was probably the most important thing out of this entire episode. On the other hand, I found the animated debut of Onomatopoeia to be quite pleasant indeed.
Ding, 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 ding.
I gotta say, the guy cracked me up. It was unfortunate that he doesn't really do anything at all, and I mean nothing, but damn, I enjoyed his screen time. This episode was definitely more focused on further building up Barbara's character, as a hit had been taken out on Gordon. This episode opens with her father clashing with her ideals about justice. I found this take on Gordon to be interesting, as he comes off far more intense. A man with 30 years experience on the force must have seen a lot of hell in Gotham. These experiences can shape someone's perspectives on humanity, whereas Barbara still believes that people can be good, but make bad decisions. They really had me believing that the man she freed was going to be the villain of the story, but the twist ended up being far better for the character and their development. It's around this point where Barbara really starts to shine in the overall narrative. And the season closes out on the Harvey Dent arc. Harvey's mayoral campaign has been a major plot point throughout the season. I frankly wasn't super enthralled with him at the start. Harvey started out as an ass and just stayed in the obsessive place. The show also didn't play around with Bruce and Harvey's friendship, not until towards the end anyway. But Batman also doesn't have friends in this show, so yeah. Harvey had been dancing around with taking bribes from Thorne, as Batman and his rogues have been interfering with his campaign. Dent has been losing sponsors and is pushed into working with Thorne. Some of his desperate attempts for public appeal include letting this orphanage go to a carnival for free. It just so happens, this orphanage almost houses the entire Bat family. Dick, Jason, Stephanie, even Carrie. I don't know how happy Starfire will be knowing Dick goofed around with Wednesday Addams. Except that this isn't Wednesday, this is Nocturna, a character that goes with Tim's desire to have made a vampire episode back in the animated series. The censors didn't like the idea of a vampire turned Batman, and it was never made. I truthfully don't really know a lot about this character other than she's kind of a discount vampire-ish, so I can't really say much in comparisons for the lore or the changes made here. I still think that this was an incredibly important encounter for the grizzled Batman, who gets another lesson in humanity. It felt greatly reminiscent of this famous moment. Also, Killer Croc cameo. Spoilers, Harvey does end up becoming Two-Face, returning to his original origin story where acid is splashed on his face. It just so happens to have been done perfectly down the middle. The Two-Face arc is actually spread between 2 episodes and closes off the season. Two-Face is an interesting tool, obviously for his state of duality, cumulative of the morals that these characters have all been dancing around, but also becomes a scar for Batman, who begins to blame himself for Harvey's down spiral. This ultimately causes him to seek help from others and to finally stop being such a selfish ass. As for Two-Face, his story isn't super original comparative to other media. Not to say that it was handled bad. In fact, this might be one of the most sympathetic variants of the character I've seen. A surprising twist for someone who was so unlikable in the beginning. Sadly, his story ends in tragedy, but ends up inspiring the characters who matter. And then the show ends with a teaser of a familiar face. So, the show isn't perfect, but it's definitely worth a watch. It goes without saying that if you're a fan of the Tim-style Batman, you ought to enjoy this show somewhat, unless you just completely hate the idea of change or different interpretations of these characters. Given the countless times I've seen these stories, I found the show to be rather fresh. Of course, a big discussion comes with comparing this show with the original animated series. To give my own 2 cents, I think it's a silly discussion. I really do. These are 2 different shows. This is not a reboot of the original. I don't think anything will top the animated series. Damn near perfection for me, not just as a Batman series, but as an animated series. For me, it is the definitive presentation of these characters. The new show, however, works on its own regard. I do wish that the setting of the 1940s was a bit more relevant. It's mostly for aesthetic purposes, and yes, I'm counting technology under that as well. I would have liked to have seen more social political issues arise, but that's probably asking too much for a Batman cartoon, even for one that is geared towards an older crowd, which is another advantage you could say that the animated series has. That show worked on the level that anyone, any age, could watch and enjoy it. Sure, it was pretty dark at times, but it also knew when to be whimsical and fun.
I'm crazy enough to take on Batman, but the IRS, no, thank you.
I find this perfect balance is why so many fans look up to this version of Batman. The animation was just so incredible to match that, and there's something about it that's reminiscent of classic cartoons like Looney Tunes and that end of an era for Warner Bros. This series has moments of rather lazy animation, and that's not a modern issue, that's a this series issue. While the hand-drawn animation does have this amazing fluidity to it, it's not impossible to match that through modern animation means, you just don't see it as much. I really don't see the same level here in terms of animation quality. Again, I really don't like comparing these two shows because they're both different, and I think they both should be enjoyed on their own right. And I think you should definitely give Caped Crusader a shot. It is clunky at times, and it's not perfect, not as perfect as the animated series, but it's still really good and definitely worth a shot. Let me know how you felt about the series in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, and if you haven't already, please subscribe as it really helps my channel out a lot. Thanks for watching, and as always, I'll see you next time.